who are meeting at Vanderbilt this weekend. And it's great to be with you, and looking forward to working with everybody on this topic. The topic of our webinar, as you all know, is privilege and power in the Capitalocene. And we're exploring how a diverse working majority can build solidarity in order to engage global capitalism, because it not only destroys the earth and exploits the working majority, but wreaks havoc in various ways. We'll get to this by exploring the fundamental distinction between privilege and power in organizing movements. And I'm really happy to be here together with my good friends and colleagues, Charlene Sinclair and Chaumtoli Hug. Not with us today is Jinyang Choi, who is our third academic fellow this year, as she's traveling to Korea. She may be watching from Korea very late at night or early in the morning, but she wasn't sure if she could be on the webinar. And so it will be the three of us engaging in a conversation today, hosted by the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt. And as always, you can find us on religionandjustice.org on our website. So here's our first point of conversation. Let me begin with raising this question of the Capitalocene. So in this new book, Gabby, maybe you can put this in the chat again, Theology in the Capitalocene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. In this new book, I'm actually using the word Capitalocene in the title, and you might be curious about what that's all about. Well, everybody is aware, of course, that we are living sort of towards the end of what has been called the Holocene. This is the geographic age of about the last 10, 11,000 years, followed, or actually preceded by the Pleistocene, which went on for 2.5 million years. And a lot of people say the Holocene is ending and it's turning into the Anthropocene. Meaning that it is now humanity which is determining the fate of the planet, and not just the fate of the planet, but really everything and anything that's happening on it. To some degree, of course, there's a lot of truth to that, but others, myself among them, have argued that maybe what's really driving things today is not 6, 7, or 8, or 9 billion people, depending on how you count it, but really the Capitalocene. What's driving this is the power of capital, the few rather than the many. There's people involved, to be sure, but it's not all of us. And that has to be taken into account. The power of capital has to be taken into account, because not only does it shape money, finance, you all know this, obviously, not only does it shape politics, but it also shapes the planet as a whole. For those of us who study religion and theology specifically, I think we also have to keep reminding ourselves that what shapes our work is also capital. Oftentimes it's overlooked that the power of capital is also shaping the world of ideas, it's shaping the world of relationships, it's shaping the world of emotions, it's shaping pretty much everything. And if you think, faith, religion, and such are independent, you might have to think again. So the question here is, why should we talk about capital, the Capitalocene? And the question I would like to pose to Charlene first, and then to Chaumtoli, is why should people of faith and people who care about justice, broadly conceived, be concerned about capitalism and the Capitalocene in the first place? What's your take on that? I mean, this is the work that you're doing, it's related to what you're doing, and so you may have a different take on it. Charlene, please go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Joerg, Chaumtoli, everyone who is in the webinar and in person at Vanderbilt. Thank you so much for this question. I think that when I enter into this question, one of the things that actually anchor me is the time that we are in, not necessarily coming out of, in terms of the clarity that the pandemic has brought us. Because what the pandemic did was to actually bring into sharp focus the level to which humanity, our lives together, was pitted against the ability to make profit. And so what emerged from that was that even those at the very bottom were framed out as though if they decided that their lives were more important than their utilization for the engine of capital, then somehow they were unpatriotic. So the notion of profit and capital as important and distinct and even priority over human life became into sharp focus during the pandemic. And so for me, it is, how do we as people of faith actually say no to that and to reorder our conversations to put humanity at the center, creation at the center, and to think about capital and the utilization of resources in service to that, not that we are in service to capital. And so I think that this is a quintessential question, and I've actually been so amazed at the level to which consumerism, profit, all these pieces have been raised as our highest good, our ultimate highest good in these times, as we saw millions and millions of people across the world, die through the pandemic. If nothing else can really tell us what we're up against, I think that should. So.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you so much for that opening statement. And we'll come back to some of these points in just a moment. Charlene and I are working basically from a Christian perspective. Chaumtoli is working from a Muslim perspective. And so she always brings things that make me think and that add something to our conversation that is very essential in so many ways. So Chaumtoli, what's your take on why should people of faith care about capital and capitalism?
Hey, again, thank you so much for including me in this conversation. And it's always wonderful to be in a cohort of sort of like-minded justice sojourners. So also, Eid Mubarak. Today is the holy holiday of Eid al-Adha, and I'm going to talk about that later, and as a storytelling, as a form of how critical a focus on capitalism is. So I'll come to that, because it's a very fascinating story about unity of, at least for the most part, the different books, children of the book, as we say. So I just want to start with, I did have to look up Capitalocene. I'm just going to be very honest. So if any of you are like, so I missed it, but now that I've read up on it, I'm down with it. But I think I really appreciated historian Jason Moore's kind of succinct kind of description of it as a critique of this idea of capitalism as being just about economics, sort of the reductionism of the economics. And we're going to talk about that in the class context, but that it's a system of power. And again, that relates to what we're going to talk about today in this webinar. And as it relates to faith, it's a system of culture, right? So faith is just simply one blueprint to thinking about our relationship to each other, to the environment, and to what Jason Moore talks about, the web of life. And I think that is so crucial to bring into this conversation today. How is capitalism, and why those of us who are looking at this from a faith lens, whether it's Islam, I come from Bangladesh, so it's a very syncretic place. There is a very strong Muslim tradition, Christian, as well as Hindu tradition, as well as other, what we call the Baul tradition, which is, so I won't go into that, but I'll focus most on Islam. So how is capitalism shaping our relationship to each other? And I think Charlene bringing up this issue of the pandemic as really surfacing that is so key. How is it shaping our relationship to the environment? One of the things that capitalism does is make us think that the environment and labor are in opposition. And that's an area of interest for me, that how do we bring ecology into our conversation? How do we connect to broader life? If we are committed to justice, if that's kind of what we're about, then we have to be concerned about who wields power how do we see ourselves? How do we define ourselves? Who are humans? Right? In the centrality of humans, we actually discriminate against other life forms. This has allowed us historically to create certain individuals as non-human, right? System of slavery, colonialism, and what have you. So how do we interrelate? So as I mentioned, faith is just one blueprint of thinking about it. That's my entry point. Each of us will have multiple entry points to this conversation. And I'll just end, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, but justice is foundational for Islam. Because capitalism validates the accumulation of wealth and capital, profit over people, Islam prohibits usury, prohibits the accumulation of capital in the hands of a few. In fact, when the Prophet Muhammad came to Medina, he saw that was a problem and created religious obligations to prevent that. So I'm going to make this assertion, and I'm not the first to do this, that Islam is at its core anti-capitalist. So those of us who are self-identified as Muslim, who at least or find some inspiration, we are guardians of the earth. We don't own the environment. God is the owner of the environment. We're just caretakers. And so when we look at labor and environment and capitalism, to me, faith is an essential part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Chaumtoli. We're really in the middle of this conversation now, because we're talking on the one hand about how these challenges really challenge us all the way to the core. This is not just a matter for politics and economics. This is really a matter for everything. It's this life world that's being shaped here. It's also a question then of how we're responding, right? And this is, of course, the interesting question, right? What do we do about it? And the problem oftentimes is that if you do not have a deep enough analysis, your solution will not be sufficient. I think this is one of the problems I find often in religious communities, that we mean well, we want to help, we want to do something, but if there is not this deeper analysis, we won't really move forward. Thank you also, Charlene, for reminding us of what the pandemic really showed, right? We started talking about essential workers, for instance. Who would have ever thought that workers were essential for anything, right? Now we know, and in some ways that is a new way of looking at work. It's a new way, I think, also of looking at the role of religion, including the divine, if you think about it from that end. In addition to that, if you think about the powerful images that come out of this, we then realize this is a multi-religious community. This is a multi-racial, multi-gendered, and all the other things that usually divide us come together here. So the fascinating thing for me is that this is not a place where we have to sort of artificially produce multiplicity and diversity. This is where it's happening. If you think about the working majority, 99% of us have to work for a living, by the way, as the place where all of this is taking place, you realize that this is probably the most diverse context the world has ever seen. The most diverse place where we're coming together. And this is the next item of discussion I would like to put out here, this question of solidarity. How do we come together? One of the basic arguments I'm making in the new book is that solidarity is that challenge that really is before us in this context. And solidarity here really includes the various components that I just mentioned. Unfortunately, of course, this is also difficult because the right has its own solidarity, which is based on identity and repression and exclusion. But what would a more progressive solidarity even look like, right? How can we even think about solidarity that respects diversity, that appreciates difference, that builds on it rather than sort of has to wrestle with it or wrangle with it? How do we think about this from a perspective on the left that's oftentimes more divided than we would like it to be? So this is the next question I would like to pose to the two of you. And this time, let me put it to Chaumtoli first and then to Charlene second. the question is this, by the way, I will put in the chat here a blog series I mentioned earlier on this conversation where both Charlene and Chaumtoli, as well as Jin Young, have written responses to my initial piece on privilege and power. You can read up on it there. And we're now referencing these contributions in this blog. In your contributions, both of you have made specific suggestions on how to form this solidarity that we're talking about. Keep in mind that the system is never really scared by questions of, politics of various different interests. The system can always respond with various forms of inclusion, perhaps hospitality, but solidarity is what really scares the system, right? When the many really become the many and the few realize that they can no longer divide and conquer us. So in your contributions, you made specific suggestions about how to form solidarity among working people. And so, Chaumtoli, for you, first the question here, how do you make use of the Islamic faith tradition in forming this solidarity? This is what you're talking about in your piece, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about how that happens.
Great. So thank you so much. So in my piece, I do focus specifically on certain concepts within Islam that I believe could be generalizable. I just want to, we're having a broader conversation around capitalism and justice and environment, not necessarily a conversation on sort of theology on Islam. And that's not my, sort of training. But for me, Islam offers an alternative departure point conceptually for imagining what are the conditions necessary for liberation and what are the conditions necessary for a deeper solidarity. A community-based organization that I've worked with, that I'm a strong sort of supporter of, called DRUM, Desis Rising Up and Moving, working with working class South Asian migrants in New York, talk about this idea of transformational solidarity. And I'm going to link that to some concepts within Islam. And the idea of a transformational solidarity, and I think it's very similar to your idea of deep solidarity, it's just using a different word, that it's collective, it's value-based, and it seeks to build long-term power for those who are marginalized by a system. So in Islam, there are two concepts that I lift up that I think gets us to this collectivist nature of rights. And so one is this idea of the ummah, the community. And in my piece, I sort of say that Martin Luther King's beloved, the idea of the beloved is also very similar. So we see actually gestures of this idea in many faith traditions. So I'm just going to sort of locate myself within the Islamic tradition. So ummah is this idea that we're multiracial. It's, everyone doesn't really, no geography, no nationalism. And in my piece, I sort of quote when Malcolm X goes to Hajj and he sees everyone bow down and pray and engage in the rituals of the faith, that we're one sort of global community, irrespective of our kinship and nationality, race, and what have you. So for me, that's one piece. I want to spend more of the time talking about something that I think oftentimes is less known. I think people are familiar with the concept of the ummah. And let me say here, this is challenging to build. There are, racism and prejudice within the Muslim community. There's segregated mosques. There is anti-Black racism within the Arab and South Asian Muslim communities. So this is not to idealize this sort of community, but I think it's just a different framework, and I'll explain a little bit why, because there are some religious obligations that ensure that no one dominates within our community. There are practices that are set, and I sort of assert that these are set so to maintain and work against the possibilities of any one community dominating. So the other, and these practices I think I've mentioned before, mandatory alms called zakat, Now, zakat is not charity. Charity is separate. It is taking your surplus wealth and contributing it to the common good. So those who have more money should contribute more. If we do this, then we will not have poverty, right? So that's the kind of idea of zakat. And there are other things regarding usury that exist in Judaism and other faiths. The other thing I wanted to sort of end with is this idea of ruhiniyat. Ruh, it means spirit, soul, our humanness. So ruhiniyat is like the glue, it binds us together. What is our spiritual solidarity? What binds us together as humans, as beings, so that each of our needs and wants are met? So ruhiniyat is in Arabic and also more kind of circulated probably in South Asia, is another concept that I think is helpful for us to build this idea of a solidarity. Because what ruhiniyat asks us to do is to think about each other as spiritual beings with life and soul. And so, and it's the essence of who we are as beings. So that if we strip ourselves of all of the categories, identities, and what have you, that make us show up, who are we at the end? What are our needs? And how can the society meet our needs? So ruhiniyat is about taking care of each other and each other's needs, but not just materially. You have to do that. That's the first. But spiritually and socially. So liberation, for me, is an apt, perhaps, analogy to ruhiniyat. Because liberation, and one of the persons that I cite is Marguerite Aziza, a Black Muslim scholar who talks about liberation as both material and spiritual. Because remember, in Western Enlightenment, this has been bifurcated, that we have the material and the spiritual, and they're broken. And I think what ruhiniyat does is says, no, we are life forms and we're beings, and we have to be connected and put back together. So I'll just end there. I know this is kind of a new idea. I haven't seen many people talk about ruhiniyat. And so it's a different framework of thinking about how do we connect to each other, both materially and spiritually. So I think when we get to that, we can get to a deeper solidarity or transformational solidarity, because it's collective through the ummah, it's spiritual and material through ruhiniyat.
Thank you so much, Chaumtoli. This is very inspiring, and I keep learning from these reflections. So thank you. Charlene, let me turn this over to you. I've always been inspired, Charlene, by your ways of engaging questions of race and class together. You know, perhaps this would be a good place for you to talk a little bit more about that, also the way you developed this in your own contribution to the intervention series.
Thank you, Joerg. I want to approach it with three movements. You know, the one that I actually did not write in the series, and then to bring in the pieces that I did write. And one that came up for me directly as I read your piece, which talks about this whole middle class, right? And you know, when I first read it, it brought to mind for me Niebuhr's framework of the amorphous middle, and the idea that there are so many people that consider themselves in the middle, that there is not enough distinction and differentiation, that doesn't necessarily draw us together, but it rather shows, it allows us to be manipulated, because everybody's in the middle, even those that are at the bottom, even those that are working class. And I think this is an important thing to understand, because, you know, I can't tell you how many times I'm in a room where people say, well, we were so poor and we did not even know we were poor. And they say it with, you know, they're just so proud. It's a pride. Yeah. And the reality is, if you're poor, you ought to know, because if you don't know, then we cannot actually organize towards a more just, economically just society. So if you think that that's not you, then it's hard for you to see yourself within a movement. And so this amorphous middle is so important. And what is also important about this amorphous middle is that it also pushes people that may have some level of means, and we'll get to this a little bit in your next question, but those that have some level of means that are engaged in maybe moving us towards a more just world can do it out of a place of more benevolence or altruism. It is, look at me, charity, look at how I'm able to do this thing. So the Niebuhr's amorphous middle is how I come to this question. And then by bringing into that in the work of Manning Marable, who draws from Antonio Gramsci to look at ideological formation, right? Because the amorphous middle is an ideological formation. And so Manning Marable, in his piece around how capitalism underdeveloped Black America, looks at the ideological formation as what he calls fraud. Because in order for capital to have its power and strength, then it must ensure that we do not rise up against it, or we don't collectivize in this solidarity that you're talking about, Joerg. So we have to ensure that those that are poor don't see themselves as poor, or they see the possibility of being a capitalist as real. And so, and particularly here in the United States, where you can go from a dirt farmer to a millionaire. Well, no, you can't. But but people do believe deeply that this is possible. And as long as that remains, then I'm looking to the capitalists as who I'm in solidarity with, not the dirt farmer. And so, and we see this, like so many people talked about, well, how did Donald Trump become president? Because most folks want to be that. They want to be this person with such, an array of things, stuff, material stuff. And so, so that is one piece. How do you look at the ideological formation that says we can all be rich, and that also says being, nobody's actually really poor through structures. They're poor because they don't work hard enough, or they made bad choices. So that is one piece. And then you put the race at the center of that, right? And with the idea that that racialized people, and we could put gender at the center of that, right? Racialized people, people that don't adhere to certain gender norms, or people that claim the frame of woman, all of those folks that somehow are not what we think of as a capitalist, right? I bet you, and I do this exercise in training, if you tell people to close their eyes and then envision a capitalist, what they'll see is the monopoly man. They will not see a Black woman, right? They will not see a Latinx woman. And so one of the things that we have to actually begin to start thinking about is, how do we unlock and disrupt that kind of ideological formation, the lies and the fraud? And one thing we have to be careful about, this is not implicit bias, right? This is the fraud that Marable's talking about, is a fraud that is woven through society in such a way that when you are confronted by even truth, you don't believe it. That's how in the DNA it is. And we see what that looks like. Like the January 6th insurrection is an example of what that looks like, when you have actually done the work of convincing people beyond the shadow of a doubt that their posture, their position is accurate. And this brings in to me this piece around faith even more, because the one thing that actually will have people believe, even believe beyond what their eyes can see, are their faith convictions. And so when you bring in this integration of faith into this fraudulent political structure, then what you have are people who actually believe that if they believe their eyes, they're acting against their God. That is a really powerful body of work that we've got to unravel. And when you think about that and what is the role that race has played, we tend to believe that the role that race has played has only been about how do you fracture the working class. But that is not the only role. You know, race has played a deep role in structuring how do you even see the human? You know, how do you see the worker? How do you see the contributor? And so if we cannot actually get to the place where we look at how our ideological notions of who is Black and who is brown has been formed, then we don't get to a clear understanding of what are the strategic points, the impact points that we may need to engage in order for people to truly see themselves across race, and then to see themselves as being in one common class construct. And so that's the way in which I think we need to really begin to start wrestling with these questions. I would put on the table that it is impossible to get to working class solidarity if we don't investigate how capital has utilized race, not just as a construct, but the actual embodiment of human beings as a piece of a capital machinery, how that has happened, and what were the tools that were used to ensure that folks will be complicit in that. If we don't get to that, then it is difficult for us to even begin to think about a strategy that will move us in another direction.
Thank you so much, Charlene. This is very powerful, and it really brings together, again, this question of race, class, and how do we build solidarity in a way that we're not usually talking about because we're separating these issues. The conclusion of the Theology in the Capitalocene book is actually a chapter on reparations, starting really with this question of reparations for African Americans in the United States, and actually arguing that we may be able to solve broader problems of capitalism and the Capitalocene in that way, in such a way that ultimately everybody benefits. But in order to get to that point, it seems to me we really have to cut through some of what you have called the fraud, what we might call the deception of people that are not quite clear who they are. 2 weeks ago, I was at the European Academy of Religion in Bologna, and a younger group of mostly British scholars now is talking about religion and class. There's also a young Muslim scholar who's working on a Muslim theology of liberation. And it was fascinating to see that what they're talking about in Europe in some ways is similar to what you were just talking about, Charlene, namely this belief that, basically everybody can make it. If you're not a millionaire, you're at least a potential millionaire, or you're somewhere in the middle. While the reality, of course, is that even if you're somewhere in the middle is not the place of rest. The middle is actually the battleground. And so many people who then think of themselves as being in the middle don't realize that they have more in common with the working class than with the ruling class. I sometimes wonder what this would mean for academics. We have some academics in the room here. If academics would realize that, well, maybe academics are not the ruling class, but actually somewhere else in the struggle entirely. And if you look at Britain, the crazy thing is that Britain actually has more social mobility than the United States at the moment. The American dream is basically dead. Social mobility is something that is sort of an idea that contributes to that fraud. I'd like to move on to one more point, and then we have a quick conclusion. And after that, we will open it up to questions. So if you're in the audience, whether in the room there at Vanderbilt or virtually, start thinking about some questions you would like us to address, and you can put them into the Q&A, or perhaps then verbalize them in the session in the room. So this final question gets to this notion of privilege and power, which is in the title of the session. One of the biggest challenges, it seems to me, in what we're talking about here is that people oftentimes confuse the two. There's a confusion of privilege and power, where people that have indeed great privilege assume that their privilege translates into power. This is something that's been with me for a while, but it really came back to me by reading some of the work of African-American theorists. Historian Barbara Field, for instance, put it this way: not all white, this is a quote from an interview with her, not all white people have the same power, and not all white people are in the same class position. The other author that I find very helpful is African-American studies scholar Kianga Yamata Taylor. Talks about, this is also a quote from one of her books, racism, she says, in the United States has never been just about abusing Black and brown people just for the sake of doing so. It has always been a means by which the most powerful white men in the country have justified their rules, made their money, and kept the rest of us at bay. In other words, by confusing power and privilege, white people assuming that their white privilege ultimately gives them all there is to have, neglect the fact that they may not have the kind of power that's suggested that they would have. In other words, distinguishing race and class, distinguishing privilege and power here without playing them off against each other, makes an argument that in this current situation, white supremacy oftentimes functions in terms of the fraud that Charlene, you were talking about, because it suggests to white warehouse workers that they have more in common with the white warehouse owners, or perhaps, you know, the Jeff Bezoses, than with the Black warehouse workers, which is, of course, you could say, a trick, an illusion. But it's also a very deeply embraced way of life, as you just said, Charlene. But this is really fooling them. Dividing and conquering here means not only dividing white and Black working people, but conquering both Black and white working people at the same time, because they're not realizing who is really in power and who is really in charge here. This is a rude awakening, of course, for perhaps your white warehouse worker, but even ruder for white professionals, white academics, white religious leaders, who usually think their privilege translates into power, because maybe they don't have the power. It's also a disappointment for minority communities, because they assume that white people have this power that most of us oftentimes don't have, because power rests in this country and in many other places in the Capitalocene with the few rather than with the many. So in this context, and this is my question now for you, the question is, how do we build power? How do we go back to solidarity? Kianga Yamata Taylor talks about what she calls a potential solidarity that has to do with the fact that when one group of workers suffer oppression, it negatively affects all workers. When one group of workers suffer oppression, it negatively affects all workers. And so she talks about what she calls a material foundation for solidarity and unity within the working majority. This is the starting point of deep solidarity, not so much an ethical appeal, you ought to be in solidarity, but simply an appeal, realize who you are, realize where you are in the system, who has the power, who doesn't, realize how power and privilege are distinct. And once you realize that, of course, then you can begin to rebuild power and to start organizing in a way that doesn't only disregard differences, but actually starts finding ways to employ them for the common good. So deep solidarity on the one hand takes into account this lack of power, the common pressures that the 99% are experiencing, but also is very clear that the place where you need to start the analysis is with those who experience the pressures in their own bodies, who are most affected by what's happening. That's where the guidance comes in. That's where the leadership is in many ways. And this is where you then start building the thing from the bottom up rather than from the top down. So let me now reverse the order again. Charlene, starting with you. What's your thinking about this distinction of privilege and power, and what difference might it make in interracial organizing in the Capitalocene where we find ourselves?
Thank you, Joerg. You know, as a community organizer, we always begin on the side of power to actually enable the folks that we are organizing to see potential and possibility. And so with power being how you can manifest your dreams, your desires, and make them real in the world in which we are currently living in. And so I think part of what we need to do is to really get to the heart of that question, you know, because I think power is often put in place of what is simply agency. You know, when we talk about power, it is, do we have the ability to shift the world towards what we want it to be for our own thriving? And if we don't have that, then who does? And then how must we be able to accumulate the kind of force, you know, in from a King sense, MLK sense, a counterforce from that capitalist force that constructs the world, right? And so one place is that we need to get clear about what is power and what does power do. It's not neutral agency that just requires me to, you know, go to a thing or protest a thing. It is, do we have the ability to literally structure the world in our interest? And so, and capital does, and we do not, right? And so we need to understand that that's what we're up against. And I actually have what might be maybe a provocative frame, because I think that privilege is actually part of the problem. Not because white people have privilege or think that they have privilege, but because privilege has been structured in such a way that it has taken over the idea of what is a human right, right? You know, we kind of accept inhumanity and human rights as somehow a privilege that a few people have, that they can maybe through their work together or solidarity help other people to acquire. And so I think on this equation, privilege is also a problem. And, you know, just for some background, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. And so one of the sermons that I did, if we call them a sermon, I talk, you know, so it's talk, right? So came from Toni Morrison's Blue Aside. And so for folks that don't know the Blue Aside, it talks about this young African-American girl who was molested, really, you know, a child, and became pregnant. And she drew within herself and began to imagine herself as a young child with blue eyes. And, you know, and we think about that and recognize that for this young child, a blue eyes meant somehow you were protected from danger in the world. And so, and I think that that's what privilege, the word privilege has become, white protection from the fact that the world is not organized for them either. Right. And so, you know, so it's easy for me to talk about privilege and this is, you know, coming from Du Bois that Rodiger took on, right? The idea of if you can have sharecroppers believe they are better than enslaved people because they are white, then you don't have to actually structure the world in their interests. They will help you structure the world against their interests. because they believe they have some level of privilege over another. And so to get to even power, we have to dismantle the idea of privilege, the notion that what should be a human right. Because when we say privilege, what do we say when we say white privilege? You know, yeah, I know I'm privileged. I go to a good school. I can live in a good house. I can get a loan. I can do this. I can vote. But all of those are rights. You know, so we are actually contributing to the idea of stratification, like stratification that is now fossilized, even as we do justice work. I have so many white people doing justice work. The first thing they say is, I know I have privilege. So you're fossilizing that idea, as opposed to coming into the conversation and being clear that we are all structured in a way that competes for crumbs. And while we are doing that, those that have power, meaning those that have the ability to manifest their own reality, they're the ones that are structuring our lives in service of their reality. And what now must we do in order for us to build that counterforce? And I think that gets us out of that box, because as long as, you know, there are people that believe that they are privileged, it is difficult for them to not actually reinforce a hierarchy, a sense of difference, a sense of altruism, as opposed to that really deep solidarity that you're talking about, Joerg. So that would be what I would say.
Thank you, Charlene. This is incredibly helpful because, you know, my hunch here really is similar to yours, that in order to deconstruct privilege, you have to become aware of how privilege and power are different and, of course, also related. We're not denying that. But then the question really is, you know, how do you handle your own privilege in such a way that it doesn't start with you? It doesn't start with this faulty idea, this fraudulent idea of your privilege, basically, you know, protecting you or ultimately putting you at the top of the universe where you not are. And so I think in order to really build this power and this solidarity, that type of privilege has to be deconstructed. You know, for theologians, we sometimes still talk about demythologization, has to be demythologized. So thank you. Chaumtoli, in your own thinking, what contribution might this distinction of privilege and power make in interreligious and international organizing? I know this is the sort of work that you've been involved in. What would that do?
Sure. I really appreciate this conversation around privilege and power, and I will start a little bit about sort of framing it within the Quranic tradition. So the Quranic call for justice, sort of as it's understood, is actually to forego individual, familial, ethnic, and kinship ties. So it's actually kind of really this global at its outset in its conception. So justice is collectivist, it's global, it's multiracial. So conceptually, that's why for me, the Ummah is so critical, right? And so, and in this call for justice, it doesn't matter if you know, this expression, not all skin folk or kin folk, right? So what that means is that in the Quranic form of justice, and it says, right, in the scripture, if I need to go against my family for justice, I should do that, right? So even if you see an ethnic, racial affiliation or affinity, if it's not moving us towards justice, the Quranic call is to go against that kinship. And that makes sense, and I won't go into early Islamic history in the sense of that's what the Prophet saw. He saw this factionalism, this early capitalism, mercantile capitalism, and wanted to institute systems in place that would change that. So one of the things that and I mentioned zakat, usury, these are religious obligations that challenge privilege. So those who actually have privilege have to make sacrifice. So today, this is a good point for me to share. a story that I grew up with that my father always shared about Eid al-Adha. You know, this is the day, a lot of times people say, oh, we don't like that Eid because that's the Eid where, you know, and animals are sacrificed and I'm vegan. But I think we lose the metaphorical symbolism of today's sort of religious holiday. One, it's the sacrifice of Abraham, we say Ibrahim, of his son Ishmael, who was actually born, right, by the mother Hajar, who's cast out of our society. So the sacrifice of Ishmael, so I mean, talk about such a phenomenal metaphor and an allegory of race, who has been cast out, then is saved by this water and the Mecca, right? And I won't, you know, but what's key in the story of the sacrifice, right, is Abraham, the way that my father sort of tells it is, it's much more fun in Bengali, but I'll have to try to translate it, is, oh, this Abraham, silly man, God had asked him to sacrifice his greatest possession, thing, not person. Abraham didn't get it. Abraham sacrificed the son that was cast out, that was marginalized, Ishmael, sacrificed a person. And so we need to, oh gosh, you know, God needs to step in and gave sort of the metaphorical animal to sacrifice. The idea is we have to sacrifice our greatest thing. So this is the anti-capitalist critique of today's holiday. We don't sacrifice each other, no. We sacrifice the sort of profit motives, the capitalism, the thing. What is our greatest possession? Money, housing, whatever it is, it's the possession that we have to sacrifice. And so we keep forgetting that. And so every year we have to remember that, is that what are we sacrificing? So solidarity, and particularly in terms of international interreligious organizing, is to remind ourselves that in this fight, in building the solidarity, we do, as Charlene mentioned, have to kind of challenge the privilege. And what Islam does is makes it mandatory by faith. You have to do this, right? It makes you a good Muslim if you actually adhere justice, right? That there are actually philosophical traditions that say, you know, it's okay, you know, you should do all these other things, right? But what makes you a true Muslim is when you fight for justice, when you actually challenge your sort of privilege and your power. So let me talk a little bit about power. The reason why this idea of community and what I mentioned, ruhinat, getting to our essence, our spirit, our soul, is critical to building. That's the vision. And these practices are ways that we need to get to that, right? It's not going to happen. You know, when Frederick Douglass says, you know, the oppressor doesn't sort of give up their privilege just on their own. It has to be demanded and it has to be required, right? But in terms of power, and we talked a little bit about mobility, it's really important to also understand within the kind of Quranic frame, there's no need for mobility. And this is what Charlene had mentioned. By virtue of your birth or by virtue of being a life form, you have an inherent right to be. I don't have to prove it. There's no miracles or evidence in Islam. It is. It just is. I am. Right? It's not I am. I think, therefore I am. I am. That's it. I don't have to prove and validate myself. And then therefore, if that is the mental frame, then everybody's needs have to be met. We must do that, right? So there's no mobility. In fact, if we have the dirt farmer or the poor, that is actually un-Islamic because you then have poverty. Because if you have poverty, you are not acting righteous and in terms of justice. So I think it's really just completely shifts. We're not about mobility. We're about reorganizing our society in a way that acknowledges the human rights of beings, right? Not just human beings, all life forms, right? So for the religious and international organizing, that no matter where you are born, what work that you are doing, your basic needs and wants as a being have to be met. This is back to Ruhinat, right? This Ru, the spirit. Your spiritual material needs have to be met. So society has to be organized in a way that those needs are met. That's where we have to go. That's what liberation is. And in order to get there, no one can dominate. We cannot have privilege. So while power, building power may be the pathway, ultimately, there is no issue of power or gaining power or losing power. Because if we have achieved the sense of justice, right, the community that we want, then all of our needs or wants are met. And they're met in a way that I don't need to struggle for you for power. I don't need to there doesn't need to be a hierarchy, right? So I just think it's really important because, and that's why I think looking at alternate faith traditions changes how we even think at and you said that, Joerg, at the beginning, how we conceptualize and frame the issue will change what pathways we get. But even when we get there, if we're still talking about power and privilege, then we've actually missed, I think, the much fundamental point is each being life form has a right to be. If we truly believe in human rights, which is the work I do, global human rights, it's not like workers need to get power and then they should topple everybody else. That's the idea, is that everyone's material and spiritual and needs should be met as part of this collective and as part of this kind of community. To get there, and I put in my piece, we can't just be like, oh, romanticizing the community. It's hard work that needs to happen. And so the practices that I mentioned are ways in which we can challenge our power, right? Because we have to challenge that, because Islam understood that people are going to try to dominate. They sort of was seeing that in society. So it's not, you have to be practical and pragmatic and strategic. And I think Charlene talks about that. I mean, in many ways, I describe the Prophet Muhammad as the best organizer, right? He understood what needed to do for the social structures to change. And it has to change both at an individual level and structurally, like both has to happen. So I'll just end on there. There's a lot more to say, but I think for this conversation, I wanted to, really, mostly because I think our audience in the United States is less familiar with kind of more the Quranic or the Islamic conceptualization of justice. And I think, it's important for us to engage with how other societies and peoples have imagined how society should be constructed. And so I think for me, in my piece, is just a way to introduce some of these concepts. So I mentioned Ummah, Ruhinat, and spiritual and sort of solidarity of where we want to go. But ultimately, it's really about liberation, about sort of a broader call for justice.
Thank you, Chaumtoli. This is, again, a gift to us to have this perspective here. One could, of course, argue the close relationship of the Abrahamic traditions here, Judaism and Christianity, as well as Islam, because the notion of justice is relational here. It's not a matter of, justice as fairness or neutrality, but justice as how do you build mutual relationships. And I think this is the question of privilege and power again as well. How do we think about these matters as relationships? The problem that I see, especially when it comes to a theological discourse, is that too oftentimes we're not really talking about this power relationship all to the core. And that includes back to the Capitalocene, the labor relationship. I would like to go on to some of the questions here. We have some questions already in the Q&A. I would like to add people in the room in just a minute. But allow me to say this about the labor relationship. The question here is not simply about who has money and who does not, who is wealthy and who is not, but who benefits at the expense of whom. And so once you look at it this way, the question is, even for those in the middle, who really benefits? People in the middle may be comfortable financially, they may have their needs met. But in the end, are they really working for the common good for the many, or are they working for the few? And capitalism has created a structure where most people are somehow considering themselves lucky to be working for the few. That includes academics. I want to say this very clearly, who oftentimes by default assume that they are working for the dominant and privileged interests, even though they may want to do alternative relationships. For the person, there was a comment on someone's nephew who just signed a $100 million contract for being able to play basketball at an elite level. Congratulations, that is just amazing. And the question then is, how do we inform this person on the newly formed privilege in relation to the community? Well, one response here might be actually to say that, you know, there's some privilege here, there may be some power, but if that person remembers who ultimately is calling the shots, that even a person that makes a lot of money may not be the one who is controlling the system. You know, there's owners of basketball teams, there's corporations involved, there's the flow of money that oftentimes gets concealed and that religious people often don't want to talk about. Then the question might be, even that person now could be reminded of their enlightened interest, self-interest and communal interest. Perhaps that's a first step at that question. But I just want to emphasize the question of relationship as we go on, because that's where it ultimately is at. You know, how do we think about our relationships and how do we think about transforming these relationships for the common good, so that those who oftentimes don't realize how much power they have can actually move forward. Let me see if there's a question in the room, perhaps, before we go to the questions in the chat. And let me invite all the participants to start posting some of your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them in a minute.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, you can see that. Thank you all so much for this really lovely conversation. I was struck, this is for all of you, but I guess beginning with Dr. Sinclair, because she brought up kind of the Gramscian concept of ideology. I think one of the things that has been so disheartening in watching things develop, especially over the last couple of years, is seeing how we not only have the kind of long-term ideological coercion, Gramsci would say hegemony, that has become kind of a common sense that, you know, we identify more with the ruling class. But there's simultaneously, and sometimes from the same people, and sometimes kind of working in competition, there's outright, misinformation is a euphemism. It's outright deception and lying. And so it seems to me like we need to address and respond to, engage in counter hegemony toward both. But do you see like the kind of concrete strategies for dismantling the long-standing, decades in the making kind of capitalist hegemony and this more illiberal authoritarian turn? Do you see those as related, or do we need to be doing two different things at once? How do you think of kind of posturing toward addressing the fraud and establishing a broad-based solidarity?
If you don't mind, would you also briefly introduce yourself or tell us your name and then?
Oh, Joshua Beckett, here with FPE. I live in Southern California.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start and hopefully, you know, my colleagues will add to that. But I think this is such an amazingly critical question in this moment. And if we think about that ideological formation and fraud from the Gramscian sense, is that part of the common sense means that there are kernels in there that people are interacting with that can go in either direction. Right. And so, you know, for us to actually transform, we have to know what that kernel is that is actually pushing people in the interest of this broader capitalist hegemony, right? And so what we tend to do is enter into all of our struggles for justice, the common language is at the world as it is. And so we enter in and are completely supporting and affirming the world as it is. The question for us is that how do we enter in and create dissonance? How do we enter in and create this dissonance that opens the question? And that opening of the question becomes the place where we might be able to move something further down the road. And I'll go back to the pandemic as a place for that. The pandemic actually opened up many questions, but what it did was also open up the idea that somehow our interrelatedness was real, right? Where, we're in a country of rugged individualism. But in that moment, we had the opportunity, which we squandered, to be quite honest. We had the opportunity to begin to talk about an interrelatedness that would get to what you were talking about, Chaumtoli, right? Because we needed to be very dependent on each other to keep each other safe. And rather from our perspective of people that are on the left or leaning in a direction of collective justice, we did not take the opportunity. And what happened was that the folks that wanted to continue to move a different political ideology entered in and framed freedom as somehow individualism. And so we have to really begin to understand what are those kernels. I love Marable because he breaks Gramsci down into accessible form. And when he talks about fraud, it is really, he talks about how do you take what is considered, a truth and wrap all of this around it so that we consent to the most illogical, illegitimate, untruth possible. And so we need to really get to the place that people are connecting with and then create the dissonance that opens up their minds to a question and then move from that place. And one last thing I would say, because I think I saw critical race theory somewhere in the chat, but that I just had this conversation with organizers who want to talk in oppositional forms. Well, those people that are opposing us and banning books, right? But what the right has been able to do is actually enter in, and the seed that they're using is, shouldn't you as a parent be able to determine, how you raise your child? And, shouldn't you have that right to determine that? And they are trying to take that right away from you. And so when we posture the folks that are saying, yes, I should have that right, as our opposition, we then actually affirm their position that they have the right. And then they then move in opposition, actually, rather than us opening up a space to say, wait, of course you have that right. How do you want to raise your child? What kind of society do you want to bring them into? Do we want to think about a more democratic society? And therefore we need X. So, that's the way in which we need to be thinking about, are we affirming hegemony and calling it justice making? Or are we understanding what is at the center of the ability of capital to move people in their direction, and how do we, trouble that water in order to open up space for us to create another common sense? So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Charlene. Chaumtoli, would you like to chime in here?
Yeah, I think I would just add that thinking about capitalism is not absolutist, right? Capitalism functions through contradictions, if we at least take a left-oriented perspective. And so what Gramsci does is extend this notion that it's not purely economic, that's ideological, right? And Foucault and all the writers, right? So therefore, there's an ideological fight to heighten the crises and contradictions of capitalism. And so how do we do that? It's going to depend on your context and place and time and all that. So your question about what are the concrete strategies, at least what I see, because my training is in law, is how do I highlight the contradictions within law and capitalism? I pay attention to when is the government and the capitalism at odds? When are they aligning, right? So we see this moment where the democracy, we're talking about it's in crisis, right? Like as if it's sort of a new thing. When the Constitution came into being, it came about in a moment when there was transatlantic slavery, there was imperialism, there was colonialism. This Constitution, right, is a product of that. So we have been in a continual state of constitutional crisis. January 6th is just the moment that appears itself as sort of, manifests itself, as Dr. Sinclair mentioned. So what's the ideological and organizing fight that needs to be waged at this moment? And so I do think there's a lot of attention right now on the Supreme Court, expanding the court. And I feel like, we're missing the point again. And I think this is where, so just to kind of bring it down, some things that we can do is this panel. Like, I think Joerg started with awareness and, challenging, providing kind of counterpoints. So the work that, each of you can do, Gramsci talks about the organic scholar, right? The organic intellectual. That's not necessarily figureheads. What is the production of knowledge that we need to actually be engaged in to challenge some of these dominant, ideas within capitalism, but also to find these moments, these cracks, these fissures that will heighten the crisis. Supposedly there's a data that more sort of young folks are drawn to socialism and left-oriented politics than ever before. So we can see this as, oh my gosh, this is a horrible moment. Or as an organizer, you can see this as, actually, this is a moment to actually do the organizing work on the ground. And that's been done by communities for a long time. So for me, the strategies would be from your location, what are the crises or what are the openings that you can actually bring in a sort of counter thinking, awareness, really sort of kind of open the door and bring people sort of along. And the strategy has to be collectivist, kind of going to the example of the nephew getting $1 million. So an easy solution would be, have him, donate. That's an individualist based strategy. But what if that wealth was redistributed in a collectivist manner, right? I don't know if it's true, Beyonce created housing in Houston for low income through her wealth, right? So how might we actually redistribute wealth in more collectivist manners? Dr. Sinclair talked about mutual aid, right? Mutual aid programs. How might we actually scale that up? So there's actually a multitude of strategies that each of you can take depending on where you are. But I think sort of understanding that capitalism has its contradictions. How is it that in the United States, right, this is sort of this idea of racial capitalism, that we have this idea of freedom and equality, yet we have the most brutal history of racial subjugation. And that in 2022, we have a Supreme Court that has essentially said, not only that women don't have bodily autonomy, that people of color, particularly Black people, don't have any safety and security, because Jalen Walker, he can be shot 60 times in the back. Nobody has bodily security. So we need to connect these movements together. It's not just abortion and then police brutality separately. None of us have bodily security and autonomy, nor do we have our economic needs met. This is really a call for coalitional solidarity, right? It's all of our issues coming together. But if we only see this as, oh, this is about abortion and women's rights, police brutality is really about race, and then, the Amazon win, that's only about class. and we don't see actually how this particular political moment presents itself for this coalitional solidarity, we're going to miss it, right? I mean, not like you got to run to the bus, but we should think much more, think a little bit more about that. So anyway, that would be kind of my response to that question.
Thank you, Chaumtoli. Time is moving quickly. We have only a few minutes left. Let me add maybe one more thing, since we're talking about Gramsci. The book Theology in the Capitalocene actually starts with Gramsci, and there I think we're not always talking about the other option. You know, there's the organic intellectual, but there's also the traditional intellectual. And Gramsci says those are people that don't realize their context. They put themselves forward as autonomous and independent. He's talking about, you know, clerics and scholars of his day. Today, we might talk about certain social scientists, theologians, people that basically want to take a step back from the involvement. And in that context, it just becomes clear that those who see themselves as autonomous and independent are fooling themselves. This is that fraud that Charlene was talking about earlier. And in doing so, they're actually supporting the status quo. So the problem here is, by not engaging the questions that we're talking about and the deep intersectionality that you're seeing here, we're becoming part of the problem. So there's no way of just staying on the sidelines. You're either a part of the solution or you're part of the problem. Now, how you become part of the solution for Gramsci, organic intellectual, has to do with actually getting into the fight, including the questions of class and the working majority. This is part of that conversation of power. You know, I think in our field, there's the lacuna. We don't really have that class analysis. And so for one, the ruling class disappears. We think the middle class is where all the power left is resting. That's of course not true. Whether it's the problem or the solution, none of it is true. And then of course, the working class disappears as well. And the middle somehow assumes itself to be independent and autonomous, like Gramsci's autonomous or traditional intellectuals. We may not have a whole lot more time for questions now, but perhaps there is one more. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Matt Kalia. I'm a postdoc at UVA. I'll try to keep the question super brief. One of the things I so appreciated about this very, very rich conversation is that you've really pushed us past the longstanding habit among at least a white anti-capitalist left of treating race as sort of just epiphenomenal to class, or as just sort of a thin layer, but you've like really driven that point home for us. I wanted to ask, what is your analysis of the present attack on trans and non-binary people in a similar spirit? What's the relationship between the attack currently on trans and non-binary people and capital, political economy, beyond simply a kind of narrow representation question or identity question? What work is that doing, and maybe how does it present an opportunity for solidarity, coalition building, or even a challenge in the way that there are actually those among the left, there are radical feminists who actually don't affirm the rights of trans people. So what does that do for the theory of solidarity?
Let's see if we can make this into a round of closing statements. Who would like to go first?
I could, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I just spoke a lot, so I want to be mindful of, I'm really happy you raised that question. So I'll do that and then I'll just close. So, you know, I think that if you think about statistically, even in sort of the trans community, that Black and Latinx are trans folks are oftentimes the most brutalized, both by the state, within the community. And so the, you know, the sort of the trans sort of, you know, global fight, and, you know, I'm a little bit familiar also within South Asia and in Bangladesh specifically, is important. It's not sort of separate. So I don't even see it as separate from like race or class, because I think that the struggle around trans rights implicates race when you look at the statistics of who is actually killed, who is isolated even within our community, And when you look at sort of the economic insecurities that are produced by our legal system. Also, what's really interesting on you talking about the turf, and it shows another aspect of capitalism we haven't talked about, which is this reproductive labor, unpaid labor, or this notion of who is valuable in our society only if you can produce a child, right? So this whole turf, you can't be a woman, ranges the spectrum of conversations that we're having around identity, essentialism. You can't be a woman because you haven't had that experiences. And then similarly, well, the abortion fight is not a trans fight which is actually not true, right? Because persons can get pregnant, but the way that the debate is being kind of cast is as if these are separate fights. And we need to actually challenge it head on. And so I'll just, there's a lot more to say on that, but we don't have a lot of time. But I do think it's integral to the fight because it challenges really deeply held notions of gender, right? And it's really challenging all of our social economic systems. So I think that we really need to be really in that intersectional fight. The last thing that, again, just, because my sort of role, I feel like here is really to offer the Quranic or Islamic frame. And I'll just end with a sweet story of with a conversation with my daughter when she was younger. In Islam, God, Allah is without form, without gender. In Bengali, in my language, when people ask me about what's your pronoun, we don't have gendered pronouns. So it's like I always get tripped up on that because, and so anyway, this conversation goes, and my daughter asked me, well, is Allah a man or a woman? I said, well, actually, Allah is without form. And so then she said, oh, so then Allah is transgendered. I said, maybe, I don't know. Deep philosophical question, think on that. But my point is that, just from the perspective of youth, we just really need to challenge and provide this sort of this different awareness about some of these issues that we sort of take for granted. And this is the moment to actually intervene. And I think the post is aptly titled Interventions, to really change kind of how we do the work that we do. So I'm just gonna end there. I don't know if it's responsive or helpful, but I think for today.
So Chaumtoli, I want to pick up on what you're talking about, because I think that we see the strategy of capitalism when we see the places where it is struggling the hardest to suppress. And so, so I think that what we have to do is look at those places to see what is happening, and we will find out what might be the places of cracks, where those cracks might be that we can intervene within. And so when it comes to trans people, just to underscore and amen what you said, Chaumtoli, it's not trans people writ large. Even though the legislative implications are writ large, but you're seeing, some really violent deaths of trans women, that Black trans women, Black Latinx trans women. And I would offer that the place in which capitalism has been able to move untethered has been through its ability to create hardened boundaries, like hardened borders, so we talk about, the structured race and really structured gender, right? Like, what's the division of labor, gender division of labor, the racialized division of labor, the fact that we now, I'm talking from a trans perspective, have the ability to break that open, to say, no, it doesn't exist at all. is actually breaking open one of the fundamental ways in which capitalism has been able to genderize division of labor in search of its profits, right? And so if we are able to break open, part of what we're dealing with is like after George Floyd, like 54% of the people that marched were young and white. And so what does that mean when we have the potential for younger white people to actually align with people of color to say no? That is threatening. So what we're seeing now are all of the ways in which the very few that can manifest their own reality are seeing the potential of the multitudes to come together and organize in opposition to that. And they are using every mechanism possible to fracture and disrupt that ability to move towards deep solidarity that you're talking about, Joerg. And so so I think that's we need to look at those places and see what is happening. And then through that, I mean, we have so many possibilities, right? So it's around, the making sure that schools do not, teach history. It is, attacking trans people. It is also doing nothing about student debt. It is also about, continuing to racialize how we engage with each other, right? So it is all of that, all in the interest of being able to have the power to structure society in their interests. And the final thing that I would say is I want to go back to when you said the I am, Chaumtoli, because, I think that is also from my Christian perspective, so deeply Christian. God says I am. And so if you talk about if we are made in the image of God, then we are. It's a statement of completion of being, not a statement around, I am this woman, I am this, that, I am this, that. And so, and ending with the fact that I am, in my mind too, is not only anchored on my Christian reality, but anchored deeply on my political reality in bringing, Fanon in the fight for Black liberation on the continent, is who said that the first thing that must go is individualism. So the ontology is not individualistic, it's a statement of being. And when we are able to push aside that individualism and recognize that we are all at risk, we all will peril, like we are all at risk unless we can begin to see each other as brother and sister, as a new creation. So the question before us is, can we look at these moments of deep disruption and deep violence and not suppress our movement forward, but rather analytically? And this is the question for the traditional and organic intellectual, because the traditional intellectual can occupy both spaces. But this is the question: can we actually utilize these moments and our training to understand what is at stake for capitalism, and then what does that mean for the strategies that we need to deploy to cleave that, make that wider, create a bigger chasm so that we might be able to move as the multitude towards a different society. And so that's what I will offer as my closing, Joerg.
Thank you, Charlene. I feel tempted also to respond to that final question, but let me just say this one thing, to raise the question as you just did in this context, I think to me is a new day, because we're not usually talking about questions of trans, LGBT, and so on in the context of the Capitalocene. And once we do that, I think we're adding something to the conversation that might actually be helpful and lead us beyond. So in conclusion, we've started a little late. We're going a little bit over time. Let me just say this. What we're finding is there's this blindness, perhaps. There's this lack of awareness that we're dealing with. Individualism is the best example for it. People assuming they're individuals in a society where everything is connected, oftentimes with great differentials of power. So that connection here is not only something that's a moral imperative, but something that's actually real. We have to think about how we're connected oftentimes for better and worse, and to see how we can reshape and change these connections. The Apostle Paul put it best, perhaps, in 1 Corinthians 12. He talks about the body of Christ, and at the end says, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And of course, if one rejoices, all rejoice together with it also. That's deeply in the spirit of the Abrahamic traditions and many other religious traditions as well that we could not talk about today. So thank you all for participating. I put in the chat that the link to the recording will be available in the Wendland-Cook Facebook page, so you can check that out there. It's going to be on our website, religionandjustice.org, as well. Stay in touch with us, like us on Facebook, stay in the conversation, and we'll continue having these conversations. Thank you so much, especially to Drs. Chaumtoli Huck and Charlene Sinclair for their very insightful and inspiring comments. They're always inspiring me, so I'm really happy at the end of this day for me here in Europe. And as you go for lunch, I wish you all a good rest of the conference at Vanderbilt, and all the visitors. Thanks for visiting. All the best, and as they say in the labor movement, in solidarity. Go in peace.